What transforms a victim into a feared figure? And what if the greatest protector of a people becomes their greatest oppressor? Prepare to unravel the mind of one of fiction's most complex characters. A man who witnessed the abyss of human cruelty and decided that the only possible response was force. Are you ready to see Magneto in a new light? Eric Lehnsherr, a name that would echo like thunder in mutant history, had his childhood and adolescence marked by one of the darkest periods in human history, the Holocaust. Instead of a normal childhood, filled with games and discoveries, Eric experienced concentration camps, where human dignity was mercilessly trampled and life was devalued to the point of being disposable. He witnessed the irreparable loss of his family, not due to illness or accidents, but due to the systemic and deliberate cruelty of a regime that promoted hatred in its purest and most destructive form. He watched parents, siblings, and friends torn from existence, reduced to numbers, annihilated by an ideology that considered some human beings unworthy of life. In that extreme environment of deprivation, constant terror, and imminent danger, Eric was not only physically shaped, marked by the scars of hunger and brutality, but also instilled with a visceral perception, a profound and undeniable understanding of what humanity is capable of doing to those it considers different or inferior. It was in this particular hell that his mutant powers, the ability to manipulate metals with the force of his mind, emerged, a physical and almost mystical manifestation of his unshakable resilience in the face of the most abject oppression. Imagine the mind of a child who, instead of learning to read and write, absorbs the dread and agony of millions. He learned, in the most brutal way, that the fragility of life is an inconvenient constant, and that passivity in the face of injustice is an explicit invitation to annihilation. For Eric, the world was not a place of peaceful coexistence and tolerance. It was a cruel stage where innocence was crushed without mercy, and the only guarantee of safety lay, paradoxically, in power. The social learning theory here is fundamental to understanding the basis of his psyche. Eric not only observed hatred, violence, and persecution, he lived every particle of these experiences on his own skin and in that of his loved ones. He learned to deeply distrust anyone who was not like him, to react vehemently to any sign of threat, and to defend himself with a ferocity that only extreme experience can forge. His psyche absorbed not only corrosive fear, but also the iron conviction that he, and those who were like him, should never again be victims. This foundation of early trauma and learning through pain, this forging of his soul in adversity, is the bedrock upon which all of Magneto's complexity and controversy would be built. The stage was set for a profound and irreversible transformation. But there was something in his future that no one saw coming, something that would solidify his grim view of the world. The trigger for Eric's transformation into Magneto was not a single, isolated event. It was a painful and repetitive sequence of traumatic experiences that, like hammer blows on a glowing anvil, forged his worldview into a sharp, unbreakable blade. After being liberated from the extermination camps, Eric, with the resilience that characterized him, desperately sought a normal life. He tried to rebuild himself from scratch, find a purpose, start a family, and perhaps finally find the much-desired peace. However, the echo of persecution and prejudice found him again, not in gas chambers, but in the indifference, intolerance, and irrational fear of ordinary society. He realized that the scars of the past were not only his, but part of a pattern of human behavior. The tragic loss of his daughter, brutally murdered by humans who feared her incipient mutant powers, was the final blow, the point of no return that shattered any remnant of hope for peaceful and harmonious coexistence. This moment of rupture not only plunged him into overwhelming and inconsolable grief, which surpassed any previous suffering, but also reinforced, with painful and undeniable clarity, his conviction that peace with humanity was a dangerous illusion, an empty promise that would only lead to more suffering and annihilation for mutants. The open wound left by his daughter's death reactivated and amplified the original trauma of the Holocaust, creating an amalgam of pain and distrust. His transformation began internally, in the depths of his psyche. Faith in human goodness was systematically replaced by a deep and bitter disillusionment, and the innate desire for peace transmuted into an ardent and irrepressible need for absolute security and, consequently, for supremacy, whatever the cost to those he considered a threat. Psychologically, Eric was developing complex post-traumatic stress disorder, not just from a single traumatic event, but from a continuous series of devastating, repetitive, and threatening experiences. With each new experience of hatred, discrimination, and violence directed at mutants, his mind recalibrated the threat, reinforcing the unwavering belief that the only way to avoid future suffering was through unquestionable domination and force. The internal conflict between the desire for peace and normalcy and the desperate need to protect his species became an erupting volcano, releasing a fury contained for decades, a despair that solidified into determination. And it was there that everything began to crumble irrevocably and dramatically, leading him down a path of no return. Magneto's mind, previously only scarred by pain and deep trauma, began to mold into an impenetrable ideological fortress, built upon the pillars of unwavering distrust and the absolute necessity of survival. His actions and words from then on were no longer random outbursts of anger or impulsive reactions. They became manifestations of a new way of thinking, coldly calculated and intrinsically defensive. For him, humanity was not merely capable of cruelty, as seen in the Holocaust, but was intrinsically and irremediably dangerous to mutant existence, an inherent peril that would manifest sooner or later. Peaceful coexistence, once a romantic ideal for some, became a dangerous fallacy in his mind, a subtle trap, an illusion that, according to his experience, would inevitably lead to a fate similar to what he and his family had faced. For Magneto, self-defense was not an option to be pondered. It was an absolute obligation, the categorical imperative for the survival of his species. He believed, with an almost religious conviction, that the only way to ensure that mutants would never again be victims, never again suffer genocidal persecutions, was through domination. It was necessary to prevent any future persecution by ensuring that mutants were in a position of unquestionable, superior, and incontestable power. This belief is a striking example of the cognitive distortion known as catastrophic thinking, where the mind, traumatized to the extreme, anticipates the worst possible scenario and treats it not as a mere possibility, but as an imminent certainty, something that will happen if he does not act. His worldview transformed into a complex system of defensive beliefs, where every act of aggression he orchestrated, no matter how violent, was justified as an essential preventive measure, a necessary evil to avoid a much greater and existential evil. He did not see himself as a villain. In his own narrative, he was a savior, a visionary leader who understood the brutal truth of mutant existence in a hostile world. He felt vested with the responsibility of being the protective shield, the strong and relentless fist of mutants. This self-perception is a powerful defense mechanism, allowing him to perform acts that would otherwise be morally repugnant. He was convinced that he was doing what was necessary, what was right in a context of survival, to ensure that the atrocities of the past would not be repeated in any way. But the true purpose and how far he was willing to go were still under construction, dormant within him, waiting for the moment to erupt. The point of no return for Magneto was not an act of sudden explosion or a whim. It was a conscious, cold, and deeply considered decision to completely abandon the utopian pursuit of integration and embrace, with all his soul and conviction, the ideology of radical separation and mutant supremacy. He was no longer just a cautious defender. He became a convinced revolutionary, a ruthless strategist who would not hesitate to use the most extreme force, the most devastating violence to achieve his goals. Peace, as conceived by most, was no longer a goal to be pursued, but an obstacle, a weakness that needed to be overcome. His worldview crystallized into a simple, brutal, and non-negotiable dichotomy: mutants versus humans, oppressors versus oppressed. The complexity of human morality, with its nuances, ethical dilemmas, and gray areas, became completely irrelevant to him, entirely subjugated to the primordial and existential necessity of mutant survival. He rationalized his severest actions, his most devastating attacks against humanity, as painful sacrifices, yet absolutely necessary for the greater good of his species. There was no room for hesitation or guilt in his mind. For Magneto, if mutants were the next stage of evolution, endowed with abilities that elevated them above humanity, then why shouldn't they lead? And if humanity stubbornly refused to accept this inevitable superiority, why shouldn't they be forced to do so for their own safety and, paradoxically, for the safety of mutants? This moral dilemma is the core of his complexity and what makes him so fascinating and disturbing at the same time. Was he a tyrant on the rise, driven by revenge and a lust for power, or a tragic prophet forced to take extreme measures in a world that stubbornly refused to accept him? His actions force us into an unsettling and uncomfortable self-questioning. What if, in his dark and radical analysis, he is right in his perception of humanity's inherent threat to mutants? Could inaction, the relentless pursuit of a coexistence he saw as utopian and naive, lead to an even more disastrous outcome for mutants, perhaps even their extinction? And what if the only way to avoid a future of persecution and extermination is, in fact, to embrace darkness in the present, inflict pain, and demonstrate power to ensure a tomorrow for his species? The line between protection, however extreme, and domination completely blurred in his mind, giving way to a singular conviction: supremacy is the only form of lasting peace. A psychological analysis of Magneto reveals a mind that, although radical and relentless in its methods, operates with a disturbing, yet undeniably consistent, internal logic. He's not driven by an irrational desire for chaos, an empty lust for power, or simple cruelty. He is driven by a profound, though distorted and radicalized, conviction that he is acting to protect his people from an inevitable future of persecution and annihilation. In his perspective, he is the bulwark against imminent genocide. His approach can be understood through the accentuated threat perception theory, a concept that explains how an individual who has experienced significant and repeated traumas, as Eric did throughout his life, develops an extreme sensitivity to any signs of danger. This sensitivity causes him to react more intensely, proactively, and often preventively to any hint of threat, even if it is perceived by others as insignificant or non-existent. For Magneto, there are no gentle choices or illusory peaceful paths. There is only the imperative need to act, for inaction would, in his view, be a death sentence. He doesn't see potential risks. He sees certainties based on the painful lessons of his past. In-depth studies on the impact of complex trauma on the human psyche, especially trauma resulting from systemic persecution and violence against groups, demonstrate how the pursuit of absolute control and unconditional security becomes the primary priority for the affected individual. The brain, in an effort of self-protection and survival, can reorganize its priorities, placing preservation and security above ethical and moral considerations that, in a state of peace and security, would be unquestionable. This explains how Magneto can rationalize acts of violence without remorse. Comparing him to historical figures who rose to power amidst extreme conflict and despair of their peoples, a disturbing pattern can be observed: the justification of severe, even brutal, actions in the name of the survival and protection of a group that feels threatened. Magneto is not crazy in the sense of being disconnected from reality or having a psychosis. He is a direct product of his experiences, a cold and relentless strategist who, based on his distorted yet consistently logical view, seeks to prevent the repetition of the past at all costs. His mind works with extreme premises, yes, but his conclusions are logically derived from those premises. It was not irrational madness or impulsiveness. It was a cold calculation, forged in the deepest pain and the unwavering determination never to be a victim again, whatever the cost to others, to the humanity he saw as a threat. Magneto's legacy is not just a series of epic conflicts or a trail of physical destruction. It is an indelible and complex stain on the tapestry of mutant and human history. His actions, driven by profound pain, overwhelming loss, and an iron conviction, have irreversibly shaped the world around him, forcing both sides, mutants and humans, to confront their deepest preconceptions, their most profound fears, and the fragility of their coexistence. He became the catalyst for an existential debate. He represents the uncomfortable and existential question: what is necessary to protect a group when the threat is systemic, historical, and seems inescapable? His tactics, though extreme and often brutal, raised valid questions about the real security of mutants in a world that historically rejected, persecuted, and marginalized them. The impact of his ideology manifests in continuous conflicts, in a mutual distrust that persists to this day, and in the uncompromising polarization between those who, like Charles Xavier, seek peaceful coexistence and those who, influenced by Magneto's shadow, believe that supremacy and force are the only guarantees of security and survival. His story invites us to a profound and uncomfortable philosophical reflection. Who are we to judge the response of someone who's been pushed to the limits of existence? Who has seen the most grotesque face of intolerance and genocidal violence? If trauma inexorably shapes perception, and if the most unbearable pain justifies action, where do we draw the thin and ambiguous line between legitimate self-defense, the protection of a people, and the oppression of those perceived as a threat? It is a mirror that forces us to see the fragility of our own moral convictions when confronted with the abyss of suffering. Magneto's impact is a dark and powerful reminder that hatred can indeed breed more hatred in a vicious and self-destructive cycle. He shows that the wounds of the past, if not addressed and healed with empathy, understanding, and justice, can manifest in future generations of conflict, perpetuating cycles of violence and retaliation. He is living proof that prolonged and extreme victimization can, in a cruel and tragic cycle, transform into a relentless pursuit of domination, a twisted way to ensure that pain is never felt again. But perhaps his struggle, however controversial and violent, was a warning, a cry of alarm about the devastating consequences of intolerance and inaction in the face of prejudice. And he, in his unique and disturbing way, may not have been the last to feel the desperate need to protect his own at all costs, even if that cost is peace and harmony in the world. Magneto's journey leads us to a disturbing reflection. To what extent can traumatic experiences distort an individual's view of the world and their choices? He became the personification of the paradox, a man who, in his desperate search for protection, transformed into a feared and relentless force. His story is not just that of a villain, but a dark mirror that questions us about the limits of resilience, the price of survival, and the complex roots of extremism. Magneto forces us to confront the idea that the line between hero and dark figure is thin, and that the greatest threats can arise from the deepest wounds of the soul. Which side would you be on if you lived in a world where your very existence was a threat?